Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Sabrina Kofer, and on behalf of Choice and ACRL, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, What Librarians Need to Know About Research Integrity, which is sponsored by Springer Nature. This session is one in a series of sponsored webinars from Choice and ACRL that addresses new ideas and developments of interest to the academic library community. Before we get started, I'd like to point out just a few features of the webinar software. All of the attendees who join the presentation are automatically muted and your cameras are off, so don't worry about generating any noise or feedback. We've got that taken care of for you. In the main area of the screen, you can follow along with the presentation materials. To adjust the size of the slides or video, you can use the divider in the middle of the screen to slide the size to your liking. We are using the Q&A feature today. Please use it to ask questions of our speakers. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation, so please do type your questions into the Q&A module as they occur to you. You can also use the upvote feature to highlight questions that you like or would like to be addressed. Also, there's closed captioning available for today's session. To toggle the automated captions on or off, please use the CC button on the bottom right corner of your screen. Last, please note that we are recording today's program and everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the archive version and where to access today's slides. And before I hand it off, I'd like to take a moment to introduce today's speakers. First, we have Chris Graff, who is Research Integrity Director at Springer Nature. We have Allison Dorr, who is Chief Editor for Nature Methods, and Dominique Morneau-Brosnan is Chief Editor of Nature Reviews Methods Primers. And before I pass it off to Chris, I'm just going to launch a quick poll here that you can respond to. And with that, we're all set, so I will hand it over to Chris.
Thanks so much, Sabrina. So there's a live poll. I'm going to answer it. Oh, no, I can't, because I'm a panelist. If I were to answer it, I'd answer very familiar. Please do click and we'll talk about the poll in a minute. So it's a really great pleasure to be here. I lead our work at Springer Nature on research integrity, also editorial policy, and also the work we do to get journals indexed widely in places like Medline and PubMed, the Web of Science from Clarivate, and Scopus, and many other, actually, 200 different indexing services. But today I'm here just to talk about research integrity. And here are the answers to the poll question. So as a librarian, how familiar are you with the topic of research integrity and ethical research practices? And perhaps unsurprisingly, many of us are somewhat familiar with the world of research integrity. And I think that's a good indicator that there's a baseline level of expertise in the room, which probably indicates that many of you are familiar with the community of, well, research integrity professionals who are more than somewhat familiar, but very familiar with the issues about research integrity. That active community in the States convenes under an organization called the Association for Research Integrity Officers, ARIO, and is made up of people who call themselves something like research integrity officers. And I'll bet that many of you here know those people within your organizations and appreciate the work that they do. I mentioned that now. Some of them I had the pleasure to work on a recently published article talking about how research integrity officers at universities in the States and people like myself and like my good colleagues who will present later on at publishers can collaborate more effectively when addressing issues, usually problem issues in research integrity. And I'm just going to put a link to that in the chat. If you are unfamiliar with the kind of people who are research integrity officers, then the institutional authors, the authors from universities on this paper are kind of examples, and perhaps some of them work at the same place where you work, and you might go and have a coffee with them or something. So there's the link in the chat. Today, we're going to focus on, oh, I clicked too many times, focus on this set of content. We'll start with a bit of reflection, really. Maybe you could start that reflection now. Think about what research integrity means to you. And we can think about the complexities there and about what kind of focus in research integrity might make the most difference. if we're intending to make a difference, which I think we all probably are. Then we'll step on to talking about training in research integrity. And I'm imagining that as research librarians, you're actively involved with training for the researchers on your campus or in your institution, and imagining that you have interests in training. So I'll share 2 references and some thoughts about how to integrate research integrity training into the whole training suite, because I think that's where it'll be most welcome and most impactful. I'll share 2 specific resources from Springer Nature. They happen to be free resources and excellent resources that you might want to use, or you might want to share with colleagues who might want to use them. But honestly, it's not a sales pitch. They alone won't make a difference, but if you do incorporate them within a comprehensive learning plan, then perhaps they will. And then I'll leave you with some closing thoughts about how research integrity is definitely something that is going to require a village, right, to get right. We all need to be participating in that work and working together, based upon some wise words from a large research funder. And that's where I'll finish my presentation and hand off to Alison. You'll take the next slot. So that's the agenda. While I've been presenting the agenda to you, I think you've been thinking about what research integrity means to you. And I wonder, I mean, if you'd like to discuss this in the chat, you'd be very welcome, whether you imagine it as something to do with misconduct and fraud and something shadowy and sinister, or whether, because it's quite easy to consider these things in a binary black and white kind of way, whether you're on the enhancing quality and reproducibility and good science side of things. Because of course, it's neither of those 2 things alone. In fact, it's a whole suite of things across a spectrum, and it's very much not binary. And I bet that's the conclusion that you came to as well. It's certainly true that the World Conference on Research Integrity, I'm a program committee member for the conference that is in its 8th edition, due in June next year. It's certainly true that the World Conference on Research Integrity considers research integrity itself to be much more than the black and white. And in fact, if you look at the categories in which the World Conference is calling for submissions, then that displays the sort of the rich breadth of interests across the spectrum of things related to research integrity, from at the top, how you create a healthy, supportive, inclusive workplace and a good research environment that's conducive to research integrity, through training, supervision and mentoring, which we'll get onto, across all of the aspects really on the slide, and so much more than the item right at the bottom, which is breaches of research integrity. So that would be where questionable practices, misconduct and fraud and things like that live. So there's so much more to the research integrity system than the dark side, or indeed the light side is pretty massive. And if you or your colleagues at your place are interested in research integrity and would like to submit an abstract for next year's World Conference, then now you know a bit more about that, and we're open for submissions right now. And one of the reasons to think about research integrity as more than just misconduct and fraud, well, Malcolm McLeod puts it quite well. This is Malcolm. He's a neuroscientist at the University of Edinburgh. He's also the research improvement lead at Edinburgh, and is one of the leaders of a network of researchers called the UK Reproducibility Network, who do things that aim to foster good research practices at a grassroots level. And this is a quote from a short sort of thought piece, an editorial that Malcolm published in Nature a couple of years ago. And he makes the assertion that while most people think research integrity has nothing to do with them because it deals with people who cheat, and of course we should be dealing with people who cheat, actually perhaps the biggest net gain is from helping good researchers, normal good researchers, to do their work a little bit more effectively, to communicate it a little bit more effectively, because that's where the aggregate impact on research as a whole and on society will be biggest. And I like Malcolm McLeod's way of thinking. I subscribe to that as well. So we have to deal with the dark side, and we will. It's the gains are really from focusing on the light side. And that's, I think, where training comes in. This is Krishma Labib. When I prepared this slide, she was still a PhD candidate. She successfully defended a PhD at the Free University in Amsterdam earlier this year. And amongst the publications that came out, she put out as a co-author during her PhD is this one, talking about education and training policies for research integrity. And it's part of a large body of work that actually comes out of the Free University. And this is just one contribution, but I think it's an important one. And it talks about how training in research integrity is, well, better done together, better to come together with the other kind of training and education that's done into the research endeavor. So per the point I made a little earlier on, the evidence suggests, Krishma's evidence suggests that the best place to do integrity training is within the context of the other trainings that are being provided to researchers, or perhaps to students at your institution. And it's also true that many universities and institutions are already providing good training, including training on research integrity. But perhaps they could be more assertive about that training or those trainings. So this is a snip, really, from the results of a survey that we, Springer Nature, conducted in Australia with the Australian Academy of Science. It's hopefully going to be a study that we repeat. In fact, we're in the midst of repeating it in the United Kingdom. We are going to repeat it in the US and elsewhere in the world as well, I believe India. But the results from Australia are kind of interesting, right? Many of the respondents to the survey, thousands of respondents who were researchers, suggested that 68%, for 68% of them, that their institution provided research integrity training. Half of them said it was mandatory, which is the universities or places of their work being quite assertive. And 3/4 of them, nearly 73%, suggested that the training for research integrity should be mandatory for holding a research position, which is actually, frankly, for me, quite an interesting proposition. I'd considered adhering to good research practice to be something that was not a compliance issue, was not something where you need mandatory training and perhaps yearly or every other year re-upping on that training to sort of record your compliance with the training and therefore the implication of compliance in practice. I'm not really into the compliance model, but perhaps the researchers in Australia who responded to the survey, perhaps they would be quite comfortable with that. And I would be really intrigued to see if that pattern is repeated in other jurisdictions as well. So there are a bunch of related thoughts on the best place where we can make an impact on helping good researchers just to be a little bit better. Marginal gains kind of theory from Malcolm McLeod, through Krishma Labib's assertion that research integrity training ought to just be simply integrated with a comprehensive training program, through to some thoughts from Australian researchers about whether that training should be mandatory or not. And here's where I introduce some resources that you might find useful. All from two resources, both from Springer Nature, both of which are free to access, and both look at research integrity from, well, different perspectives. This is the newest of the courses that my team has launched. amongst a great deal of resource that you can find on the Springer Nature website. It was new earlier this year, and it's an introduction to research integrity designed for researchers. It's self-paced in English, 45 minutes long, requires registration, doesn't require anything else, and covers many aspects from the research end of things through to the research communication end of things. So these are the topics. It's what is research integrity begins, and then on the left-hand side you can see some of the things that you will think are either associated with research integrity or research ethics. Perhaps the study, design, execution is more on the integrity side. Perhaps ethics, approval, and informed consent and animal research aspects are more on the ethics side. Through to beginning with authorship, and then through the right-hand side, the things that are more orientated towards research communication. From authorship through data sharing, of course, data collection and archiving would be actually a research practice, not a research communication practice, but the sharing of the data beyond the archive is the communication part. Through reporting guidelines, and then the things that are on the dark side, like avoiding plagiarism, conflicts of interest, citation manipulation, duplicate submissions, and then addressing issues like predatory publishers, and landing finally on paper mills, which if you haven't thought much about recently, I suggest you do. There's a lot of interesting conversation about paper mills ongoing right now. So that's the first of the resources. You got a link there on the screen. I can't copy and paste, but maybe the organizers can into the chat. But if you want to snip that QR code, that will also take you to the website where you can get the course. That's the first course, and it's from aiming to be addressing things for researchers from a research point of view, but it's also very likely that many of your faculty members are also editors or peer reviewers, and so we also have a nice and pretty extensive course that equips editors and people, I guess people wanting to be editors, or probably even people wanting to know how an editor thinks, and I bet there are loads of those in your faculty. Equips editors and people like that with a whole wealth of information in 3 modules across the basics of peer review processes, the innovations in peer review, and then some ethical aspects or integrity aspects like peer review confidentiality and conflicts of interest. Through the module 2, which is about what makes a good reviewer. And then again, some ethical aspects like submission fraud and reviewer fraud. And onto module 3, which looks at how editors consider the reports that peer reviewers provide to them, and then the indicators of a good or poor peer review within a journal. Another really good course. If you would like to take a look at it, there's a link on the screen, and yeah, maybe Esther, you could post that to the chat as well. But again, there's a QR code that if you're into QR codes, you can use, and that will take you to the URL as well. So there you go, some thoughts on training, sort of reflecting not only on how to set up good training, but also providing you with a couple of resources, maybe for inspiration or use or comparison with the resources you already offer. Which brings me to my closing thoughts. This is a quote from a white paper that the DFG, the German Research Foundation, put out a little over a year ago. If you don't know, the German Research Foundation is a large, obviously European public research funder that issues 3.6 billion euros worth of funding in 2021, presumably something like that in 22 and 23, which I appreciate is a little shy of the total federal grant funding in the US, which might be something like 180 billion. I looked it up yesterday as something like that. So, but still, by any means, a large chunk of change. And they're very interested in ensuring that research funding, as many research funders are, is spent wisely. And that means they're really interested in research assessment. And the white paper that the DFG put out was all about how the role really for academic publishing as a foundation and as an area of leverage for research assessment. So they want to think about, they're thinking at the DFG about how changes to the way that publishing is done can make research a better place, a place that's has more integrity. And the quote here is a selective, obviously, from the report, and it says that it's really important that we ensure the publishing system develops, changes, right? They're calling for change here in a way that's conducive to good scholarship and to integrity, right? And thereby enables or supports academics, researchers to avoid succumbing to misguided incentives, the kind of incentives that get us into tricky places with integrity questions. And I think that's a really sensible quote. The rest of the report goes into an enormous amount of detail, but wrapped around this concept is the idea that building this system that's conducive to scholarship is something that requires action from multiple stakeholders, including publishers, but of course, including people closer to home in the research institutions where research is actually conducted, including, of course, and naturally, the library and librarian community. So they're really saying is that research integrity or a system that's conducive to scholarship is everybody's business, and that delivering research integrity is something that we can only do if we try and do it together. And that's where I'll close. Thank you ever so much. I really look forward to your questions at the end. But before that, I'll hand on to Alison for our next presentation. Alison, over to you.
Thank you, Chris. And hello, everyone. I'm happy to be here today representing the Nature Research Journals and my own journal, Nature Methods. And in my view as a journal editor, transparency in a published research paper is really key for promoting research integrity and reproducibility. And really all sections of a manuscript have a role to play in this regard. Starting from the introduction, what was the previous work that's been done in this area, supported by a responsible reference list? The methods section describes what did you do, how did you do it, what tools did you use? The results section will describe the data, but where can you also find that raw data set? Where can an interested reader understand that the data that the authors collected supports the conclusions they made in the paper? A discussion should discuss the limitations of the study, plans for future work, and finally, things like the author list, the acknowledgements, and the ethics declaration explains who did the work, who funded the work, and do the authors stand to have any financial gain from publishing the work. So today, I'm going, oops, sorry, not too far. Today, I'm going to focus on two key aspects of research integrity, and that's methods reporting and data reporting. So the Nature Research Journals all encourage authors to provide very detailed methods descriptions for their research papers. We don't have a word count limit on this section, so authors can provide as much information as they possibly can. We encourage the use of supplementary information, such as supplementary notes. And we also encourage, for a complicated and possibly new methodology, we encourage authors to develop a step-by-step protocol, which can be a supplementary file. And best practices also dictate that authors would upload that protocol into a repository, such as Protocol Exchange, which is our own in-house product, which is free for everybody to, browse through the protocols. And then also cite that protocol DOI in the reference list. And the goal really with the methods section is to have a reader be able to fully understand how the authors did the work, as well as potentially reproduce it. Unique materials are a part of this. So if authors have used things like developed things such as plasmids or antibodies, used unique chemical compounds, cell lines, or animal models, they must agree to make it available in some way. So if there's a repository available, such as Adgene for plasmids, authors are encouraged to deposit that in the repository and provide the accession code in the paper. Oftentimes authors are using commercially available materials, so then they must provide the sources and the catalog numbers in the methods section. And if there's no repository and a unique material is not commercially available, then they must agree to provide it to an interested reader upon reasonable request for a reasonable fee. For many years now, actually, the Nature Research Life Sciences journals have been requiring authors to fill in a reporting summary. And this is basically a checklist that focuses on key basic elements that are sometimes nonetheless overlooked by both authors and reviewers. Things having to do with experimental design, statistical information, information about unique materials, animal and human subject ethical guidelines. This checklist contains some technique-specific modules, for example, for flow cytometry and MRI data. We also have separate reporting tables for specific data types, particularly for reporting three-dimensional protein structures. And so this reporting summary is available to the reviewers. We ask authors to fill it out before peer review. And it also is checked by in-house statistical experts at the accept stage. Another aspect, an important aspect of methods reporting is software and code. Software is being increasingly used to analyze results, especially in life sciences papers. And most nature research journals require that code be made available to readers if it's central to the paper. And in fact, many of the journals require that authors provide this before the peer review stage so that the reviewers can review the code and test it out with their own data if they choose. And we also have a code reporting checklist when code is central to the paper. It really does depend on how central the code is to the paper, but we typically will require a description of the algorithm, the source code, and compiled software. And so if authors do have code in their paper, we will ask them to fill in a code availability statement. This is part of the methods section of the paper. And basically it describes where the code availability, conditions of access, and where the code can be found. So best practices dictate that authors are providing the code via an established repository, such as GitHub. They're minting a DOI for that code and including it in the reference list of the paper, so it's easy to find, and so it's citable. They should use versioning, so version 1, version 2. And even if they improve their software over time, they need to ensure that that version that was used to generate the results in the paper continues to be available for the sake of reproducibility. They should provide clear documentation for installation and use. They should provide a software license. This is really important because if you don't provide a license, then technically people legally can't use it. Ideally, it's going to be open source, but any restrictions must be stated. And finally, authors should provide sample data, ideally, which will help others test run the software and make sure it's working correctly in their hands. Very briefly, I will talk a little bit about CodeOcean. So this is a company that we at Nature Methods and also several other nature research journals, it's an external company that we partner with, and they provide a very nice service that helps authors build a containerized version of their software. This is called a compute capsule. So basically, everything that somebody who's interested in using this software needs to run the software is available in this containerized capsule. So authors can create this prior to peer review. It provides a really nice interface for reviewers for checking the code and testing the code. And then once the paper is published, it's a very nice package for a potential user to be able to utilize that software in their own research. So moving on to data reporting, the Nature research journals promote data sharing and data citation as best practices. There are many types of data that we mandate must be shared in an established repository, things like gene sequences, protein structures, etc. Of course, there are many types of data that there isn't a suitable repository available, or that we don't mandate a repository because there's not a stable repository at the moment. Authors are still encouraged to use general purpose repositories such as Figshare as much as possible to share their data. We also strongly encourage citing dataset DOIs on the reference list, again, for citability and easy to find, making it easy to find. And we also ask for source data that's underlying the graphs in a paper and also gels and blots. And we also try to enforce best practices in data representation, things like avoiding bar graphs, showing the full data distribution, avoiding red-green contrast for the sake of colorblind readers, and showing scale bars and things like microscopy data. Every paper we publish includes a data availability statement. So this is a section of the paper that states how the data supporting the results can be accessed. Again, we strongly encourage that authors make use of public repositories and provide the links in the data availability statement. If they haven't generated data, but they're analyzing publicly available data, they should also provide a link so the readers know where to find that. They should describe any details of source data in the paper, state any restrictions on access to the data. And I wanted to point out that we really do discourage data available upon request statements. So many times it's hard for readers to contact the authors. The authors are slow to respond. We really want to promote data sharing, active data sharing rather than passive data sharing. And there really has to be a good reason that data is only available upon request. Maybe it's because it's a huge data set, terabytes in size, and they can't find a repository that will take it, or maybe it's human data, and so there are some privacy concerns with it. But other than that, there really needs to be a good reason to only make it available upon request. So very briefly, we strive for transparency, not just in published papers, but also in the peer review process itself. So the Nature research journals have several different options for peer review. One is called transparent peer review. So authors can choose whether they want to publish the anonymized reviewer reports with the paper. And this is offered at an increasingly larger number of Nature research journals. We also have something called reviewer recognition, and this is where the reviewers can choose whether they want to be named on the published paper. We do allow reviewers to sign their reports, which will, of course, reveal themselves to the authors and potentially to readers if the authors decide to select the transparent peer review option. And we also offer double-blind peer review, so both authors and reviewers are anonymous, though I have to say this is not a very popular option. And I wanted to talk a little bit about a new initiative that my journal, Nature Methods, has adopted that I'm personally very excited about, and also several other Nature research journals are increasingly adopting. So this format is called registered reports, and it's really a final registered report. A published paper will look pretty much like a regular research paper, but the way the format differs is in the peer review process. So in a typical research paper, the authors would design their research study, they would collect results, they would analyze them, and then they would write up a paper and submit it to a journal. So registered reports kind of turns this on its head. So the peer review process takes place at the experimental design stage. So basically, authors would submit a detailed experimental plan. The journal would peer review that. The reviewers would basically be asked to check first of all, how interesting is this research question they're asking, but also how sound is their experimental plan. That might go through a couple rounds of peer review. And if the reviewers are happy with the experimental plan and the journal is happy with the plan, then the journal can offer to accept that paper in principle. So again, this is before any results have been collected. The authors would then go off and perform their experiments and analyze their data and submit the final version of the paper, which now looks like a regular research paper. And that again goes back to the reviewers, but the reviewers are asked to only check the soundness of whether the authors stuck to their experimental plan and whether they make reasonable interpretations of their data. So the journal would not reject at that point because a reviewer thinks the results are not exciting. So I really think this is going to be an increasingly useful format to help support research integrity because it shifts the peer review to the research plan rather than to the question of, how exciting are these results? And finally, at my journal, we're very passionate about supporting research integrity and also communicating what we do as journal editors to the research community. So we publish a lot of editorials on such topics. These are all in front of the paywall, so I encourage you to check them out. These are just a couple of examples of topics that I think are related to research integrity. So in summary, I think transparency in published manuscripts is really key to research integrity, especially methods reporting and data reporting. And there are some newer initiatives at the Nature Research journals that help support research integrity, such as new peer review initiatives and also a newer format called registered reports. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Dominique.
Great, thanks so much, Allison. So I am really excited to be here as well, talking about how reviews journals can promote research integrity, and specifically I'll be talking a lot about what Nature Reviews Methods Primers does. So the Nature Reviews portfolio includes 23 journals across the clinical, life, and physical sciences. We also have 2 primer journals. We have disease primers and methods primers. So it may not be immediately obvious that reviews journals have much of a role to play in promoting and ensuring research integrity. And the Nature Reviews journals are authoritative and agenda setting. They provide a platform for critiquing the body of literature on a given subject. And this includes the best ways to conduct research. Nature Reviews publishes a huge range of article types, including consensus statements, evidence-based guidelines, and expert recommendations. These articles typically address issues that are controversial or unclear and have wide implications for research practice or current thinking in the field. Evidence-based guidelines are systematically developed recommendations for achieving standardized research or clinical practice. And consensus statements are comprehensive analyses by a panel of experts of a scientific or medical issue. Some of the physical sciences journals also publish methods-based reviews that generally provide summaries of techniques, devices, or materials, and importantly, comparisons of different methods. Nature Reviews Methods Primers is the only Nature Reviews journal that's dedicated to publishing introductory overviews of methods in topics across the entire Nature Reviews portfolio. And I'll get that into what we do a little bit more in a few slides. So when I launched Methods Primers, I looked at what I considered to be the main areas for promoting research integrity and wanted to focus on those. And to me, these were methodology, analysis, and data management and sharing. Every single researcher has the experience of trying to use a new method and getting directed from one paper to another to find what they need, whether that's parameters, setup, sample preparation, how to run your experiments. And then there's more run around to find the optimal way to analyze your data often with the use of black box analytical methods and statistical tests that aren't clear. Some fields have really clear standards for data storage and management. For example, the field of genomics and a lot of fields in life sciences are really leading the way on this, but other fields don't have these standards and data is handled in a much more haphazard way. At Nature Review's Methods Primers, our articles provide a single location for researchers to find all of the guidelines they need for study design, analysis, and reporting. The articles have a rigid structure that's set by the journal that ensures that each primer contains all of the key elements that readers need to adopt a method at each stage. And we try to avoid having black boxes where analytical methods are too complicated or proprietary, so that the user doesn't really know or understand how they work. We ask authors to indicate all of the open science and open data standards in the field, and where those don't exist, we encourage them to discuss where data should be shared, as well as minimum reporting standards. And next, I'll just go through a few examples of some components of primers that we think contribute to research integrity. So every primer is going to outline the best practices for experimental design, but some primers include checklists like this to aid in experimental design. So these two examples are showing the various decision points in an experiment and the questions that researchers should be asking themselves. So for example, our primer on high throughput CRISPR screens included a list of questions that researchers should go through while they design their experiment. They also included repositories for where people can obtain plasmids and gave readers an idea of the number of cells they should be using for the right coverage. So since these are written by thought leaders in the field, it really gives readers a starting point for how to get started with this method. Each of these steps require optimization. So we appreciate that this can slow down an experiment, but it also increases its robustness and chance of success. And these checklists often include advice on whether the method is appropriate for the starting material, for the research question. It also provides advice on sample preparation and sizes to ensure significance and where to find additional resources. Most primers contain some kind of comparison of analytical tools, usually in a table like this, so that the information is easy to find and compare. So in this example, we've got a wet lab analysis that provides information on different separation tools that can be used, how these are used, and their advantages and disadvantages. We also have these types of tables for computational analytical methods as well. Every primer is going to include minimum reporting standards, but some of them do actually include checklists for reporting. So this is especially true, something we insist on with statistical methods, because these can be really difficult for readers to understand. So in this example, the authors included an update of their reporting standards checklist for Bayesian statistics. Each of these points is an important bit of information that helps researchers interpret the data and validity of the findings. So they really do need to be presented in every method section when using Bayesian statistics. Every primer also includes discussion of data repositories, though they're not always going to have this kind of direct comparison. This obviously depends on how many data repositories there are in the field, if there are any, and what the standards are for data sharing. But in these two examples, I've got direct comparisons of different data repositories. So both are describing the type of data that's stored there. And on the right, we've also got information on whether the repositories are curated and updated. And we've also included URLs for easy access. So we're an online-only journal, and we find having this information in one place where readers can just click through to the repository that best suits their needs is really helpful. And I know Allison talked about code, documentation of code, but I'm going to go through it again because it is really important. Primers outline the appropriate repositories for code, what metadata needs to be included, and any entry requirements for these repositories. And sometimes primers will include examples of data analysis. So we ask for code availability statements in those cases. So I've got two examples of this here. In the middle, you'll see that this is a code availability statement for code that came from another source. So the reason we've still done this statement is because since this was so central to the analysis and to the examples that were used in the primer, we wanted readers to be able to quickly find what they needed as opposed to sort of digging through the reference list. And the bottom example is from a primer where the authors created their own code to show data analysis. So in that case, we asked them to submit this in GitHub, providing README files and sample data so that readers could sort of run their own tutorial and follow along with the analysis. And of course, versioning of code is also really important for research integrity. So code is often deposited in a repository, but then down the line, it gets upgraded or altered, like Allison said. And these upgrades can affect the outcome of analyses. So it's really important for both reproducibility, but also replicability, that we have versioning information for code. So usually we would recommend Zenodo because it provides a DOI for code and data, which makes it citable and trackable. So each upgrade is then deposited as a separate entry with a new DOI, and you can always access the old one. GitHub does provide versioning, and it documents all changes and upgrades that are made to the code, but as far as I know, it doesn't actually save the old version. It would have to be done as a separate entry, and whether or not that's something that happens is sort of up to the person who owns it. And finally, containers are another really great way to maintain a certain version of the code. With containers, all of the code, the tools, libraries, and dependencies, and sometimes test data that are needed to run it are kept and isolated within a container that's then downloaded and run independently. So Allison mentioned CodeOcean. We have had people work with Docker, which is one of the more popular containerization tools. And what this does is, regardless of what you have on your machine, the software and code are being run independently and in an isolated environment, so nothing is interacting or interfering with anything else. We've actually recently published a primer on containerization for reproducibility, which outlines how these work and how to build containers. So finally, I hope that I've made it clear that reviews can be an important part of promoting and ensuring research integrity. Checklists help researchers determine the best course of action at each decision point and ensure that experiments meet current best practices. And data and code sharing are key. So information on the best repositories for sharing different data types and code will help researchers make the best choice. And from my perspective, these are 2 points where I think our audience can really help their researchers by providing these resources in a single location. And finally, code should be versioned and made accessible in a public repository, preferably with a DOI or other identifier. So I want to thank you all for your attention, and we're going to hand over to a Q&A.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks so much, Chris, Dominique, and Allison for your presentations. Looks like we have a little over 10 minutes to answer some questions, so I'll just encourage our audience, if you haven't submitted a question yet, feel free to do so. And you can also upvote any questions that you like. So to start, we have a question here from Laura that I think is for Allison. It says, in addition to disciplinary/subject repositories and generalist repositories like Figshare, do you consider trusted institutional repositories an acceptable option for research data availability?
Yes, I think so. We do maintain a list of somewhere on our website, which I can find the link if people are interested. But we do maintain a list of suggested repositories. I think an institutional repository would be an acceptable way of making data available. I mean, I think the thing that we really want to avoid is authors providing a link to their website, because websites can change, authors can move institutions, the person who's maintaining the website might leave. So we really try to get the data in a place where we can have some reasonable assurance that readers are going to be able to access it for the long term.
Okay, great. Okay, let's see. We have another question. This just came in. Okay, as research increasingly incorporates artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms in data analysis and decision making, how can researchers maintain transparency and accountability in algorithmic processes to guard against inadvertent biases, data manipulation, and unfair algorithmic outcomes, thereby upholding the principles of research integrity in this technologically advanced landscape? I'll just throw that out to the group.
You know, that's the billion-dollar question, isn't it? Really, at the moment? I mean, I'd like it if Alison or Dominique wanted to add their thoughts, but I'd be very happy to say that my thoughts are that responsible research has always been this way. You know, using different tools and different approaches, innovation has always delivered these to the fingertips or to the labs of researchers. And actually, the AI is a step change different, right? But it still requires careful thought and use and transparency. And perhaps that's what we should be aiming for, as much transparency as is possible. And that's where I'll stop and hand it over to good colleagues.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question, and you know, it's something that, of course, our publisher is grappling with, and just trying to kind of stay one step ahead of AI tools. As Chris says, in you know, transparency is really important. So, for example, we came out with a policy maybe just a couple of months ago that basically said ChatGPT cannot be listed as an author on a paper. And if authors used it as a tool to help write a paper, they need to acknowledge that in the methods section of the paper, or the acknowledgements or something like that. But it cannot, it's not a person, so it can't be an author. You know, I think the tools for people who are cheating is nothing new. We all know that there are people who cheat in science to try to get that big paper, and you know, it takes some time, but usually those people get found out at some point, and there's going to be a retraction. And you know, we just heard things in the news last week about a particular researcher. So you know, this is nothing new. The tools are getting more advanced, so we kind of have to stay on top of them a little more. But I think many publishers are thinking about ways to, you know, basically always stay one step ahead of tools that people are using to manipulate data. You know, thankfully, I think it's rare. These cases become news because it is a rare thing. But yeah, it's a big question and a big problem.
And I'll just add that, you know, if you want, as a researcher, to stay as transparent as possible, some of the things that we ask you to share are your training data, so that reviewers and users can assess for themselves if there's any bias in your training data, so that, you know, they know how your AI, your machine learning algorithm was trained, and therefore how you ended up getting to what the final result was.
Okay, great. And right before we move to the next question, I'll just launch a quick poll for everyone. Okay, and then back to our questions, sort of along the lines of the last question. But Lori asks, do you have a method for screening for AI-generated text in manuscripts?
Well, I can take that one. Do we have? Yes. Is it fully implemented? Not yet. And will it keep up with the increasingly sophisticated large language models? Probably not. So, but you know, we have hope, because there are certain things that large language models can't do very well at the moment, at the least. So when we get it implemented, i.e. into the workflow, so that it is being, each new manuscript is being run through this screen tool, then we'll be in a better place for a while, until ChatGPT or GPT-7 gets better than us, and then we'll keep trying. I think there are ways, so I feel quite positive about that. Thanks for the question.
Okay, let's see. Another question here. Let's see, Maria asks, why do you disallow bar chart analyses?
I think that's probably for me. We don't, sometimes a bar chart is useful for displaying data. We don't strictly, disallow it, but there are better ways of displaying data, and, showing all of the data points is useful. Showing a bar with an error bar is kind of a little bit difficult to interpret. So it's not that it's wrong, it's just that there's better ways, such as box plots, things like that are kind of more modern ways of displaying data.
Okay, great. Let's see, the question sort of about librarian responsibility, I suppose, but perhaps a bit tangential, but as a librarian helping a grad student whose work was plagiarized in a journal article, should I contact the editor about their inadequate response? The student is concerned about becoming that person in a very small field. So what is my professional responsibility?
Sounds like one for me, doesn't it? At least to start with. Yeah, what an awkward situation. I feel your pain and the pain of your grad student. You also indicate that the response from the editor is inadequate. And so I'd suggest a couple of different things. I mentioned the community of research integrity officers in the USA, that you must have somebody at your university who is responsible for that sort of thing. I think you probably do. And I'd suggest taking it to them to ask for their assistance in addressing the issue where the issue occurred, and then following due process, really, following the steps to investigate and understand the problem in depth, and then working out the right course of action from there, which may well include communicating with the journal. And if the journal editor has been offered a response that you're not happy with, then there is an alternative. It depends on the publisher, actually. But at Springer Nature, we have a dedicated research integrity team that I lead, right? Full of people very familiar with these kinds of issues and very familiar with following the right kind of process to get them looked at from the point of view of the publishing house and the editor, and working with editorial teams to make the right kind of recommendation. So if it were a Springer Nature journal, I'd suggest bring it to me via my team. There's an email address for that, which is kind of an obvious one. I'll just say it. It's ethics.reporting. So ethics.reporting, right, at springernature.com. And you'll find that if the journal is published by another reputable and leading publisher, that they will have a similar way to get in touch with their research integrity team. So there's two suggestions for you: the RIO, or the research integrity officer at your place, or bring it to a research integrity team, and we'll take a look at a publishing end. Thank you for the question.
Okay, great. So we have time for one or two more. Question is, how can I find out more about research integrity as a librarianship student? So I know we had some like resources earlier in the presentation, but maybe just some general sources too.
I'm assuming that you're from the US because you're on this webinar, but you might not be. So there is the Association of Research Integrity Officers. They all provide materials with a US slant, and the regulatory environment in the US is different, so it's worth looking at those. But there are also networks of research integrity officers outside of the US. For example, there's the European Network of Research Integrity Officers, or the Asia Pacific Network for Research Integrity Officers, and those would be good places to start as well. None of them will have, materials expressly designed for you as a librarianship student, but I'm sure that you could redesign them or pick the bits that are best for you and therefore get what you want. Hope that's useful.
Okay, great. Yeah, looks like we're in our last minute here. So I'll just say thanks so much to Chris, Allison, and Dominique for taking the time to speak with us today. And thank you to our attendees for your engagement with your questions and comments. I'd like to remind our viewers that we did record today's program, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email from Choice and ACRL with a link to the recording, as well as where to access today's slides. Also, if you have a few minutes after the presentation to fill out a brief survey, we would really appreciate it. So thanks again to all of you out there for joining us. We hope you learned something new from this session and hope to see you again in the near future on another webinar.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.